Welcome to the first speaker series event of First Mondays 2014-2015. My name's Alex Suber. I'm a part of Blue Key Honor Society and a senior here at Colorado College. I'd like to invite you in helping me welcome the Executive Director of the Sierra Club, Michael Brune, to Colorado College today. The Sierra Club is one of the oldest environmental organizations in the country and boasts over 20 million members and supporters. Their Beyond Coal campaign has been successful in shutting down over 160 coal-fired power plants. And Michael Brune's career has spanned the fields of authorship and activism, and his talk titled America's Energy Future, Cleaner, Better, Brighter, will focus a bit on the state of environmental activism near and far. Over the past few years, there's been a surge in UN summits, grassroots protests, scientific research, and overall public commentary on the topic of climate change. It's hard not to pick up the New York Times and see an article concerned with drought, deforestation, carbon regulation, and I think we study these things at school. I think at CC, we reflect these sentiments, but oftentimes struggle to find an outlet for our energy. So since I've been at this school, I've seen the transformation of the Sustainability Office, the formation of the Student Divestment Committee, and the expansion of the Synergy Program. All of these initiatives have been student-driven and student-led. It's my hope that by bringing a speaker to First Mondays focused on climate and energy, we can inspire a new generation of activism on CC's campus. And that's exactly what First Mondays is for. First Mondays is really unique. We all come together as a community, and we get to engage in discourse on issues that are close to us. And anyone can propose an event. I just went to the CC website, had an idea, submitted a proposal, and here we are. And I'd like to thank the Jonovich Lecture Fund and the Sustainability Office for supporting us. Also, I invite you to stick around after the talk for continued discussion and local food outside on the quad, as you saw. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael Brune.
All right, thank you, Alex. Hi, everybody. How you doing? Thank you. All right, so let me start with a couple of disclaimers. First, I didn't know that this was going to be the first in the series of First Monday's lecture series this year. So I wanted to just offer a guarantee that this will be the best lecture that you've heard all year, First Mondays, and also the worst that you've heard so far this year, since it is the first. And then the second disclaimer is that I have a bit of an irreverent personality, a little bit of a subversive personality, and it's a little intimidating to be irreverent and subversive here in this chapel. So this will be a polite, subdued, sober conversation. So Alex gave you a little bit of an introduction to me, so it's a little bit difficult to talk in this environment without knowing a little bit about all of you. So if you don't mind, I just wanted to ask all of you a few questions. Yeah? All right, so how many of you are from in-state, here in Colorado? All right, wow. How many of you then are from out of state? Even more. All right. How many are from the East Coast? Nice. Anybody on the West Coast? Anybody from the great state of New Jersey? All right. Good. You know where my bias lies. Okay, anybody, how many folks here are environmental studies majors? Okay, how many biology majors? How many folks are going deep into the humanities? Wait, hold on. Why did the biology studies majors not shout as loud as the environmental studies majors? Something going on? How many folks are going into the humanities? Okay. Okay, so when you all graduate from this fine institution 2, 3, 4, 8 years down the road, how many folks here want to work in the private sector? Just raise your hands. Okay. All right. How many folks want to work in nonprofits or in academia? Okay. Hold on. How many people don't want to work? All right. How many folks want to go into public service? You want to be mayor, you want to be the head of the sustainability office in some city, you want to be president someday. Okay. There's other categories I'm sure that everybody else was waiting for, but I'm not sure what they were. Okay. So last question, and this is a serious one. When you think about climate change, and when you look at the news reports that are coming across your computer screen every other week, you read the latest report from the IPCC, or you hear what's happening in terms of extreme weather events all around the world. Maybe you look at the Congress that we have right now, or you look at the ways in which governments are responding through the UN, and you look at what's happening in terms of some countries making reductions in carbon emissions, price of clean energy dropping. How many folks here, raise your hand, feel optimistic that we will stave off the worst effects of climate change, and generally speaking, 30 years down the road, we'll use that as a single point in time, 30 years down the road, we'll be able to look back and say, we did it. We did it as best we could, and we pretty much got the job done. How many folks think we'll be able to say that? The lights are bright, so I can't really see more than 5, 8 people raising their hands. Okay, and then how many folks will say, we're going to try, but we're in deep trouble? We'll make a little bit of progress, but profoundly, we're not going to be able to do it. All right. Ouch. So that's what I wanted to talk about. That's what I thought would be really good to discuss today, is how do we live in this moment? And how do we reconcile our passion for nature? How do we reconcile the thought that we're going to be losing some of the places that we love? We're going to put at risk a lot of the people that we care about. We're going to grow up, even though we're at different ages, we're going to grow up in a time where we see a lot of our ecosystems being degraded, hundreds of millions of people being put under threat, whether it's severe water shortages or danger from extreme weather events. We're going to see a time in which our governments are going to become under increasing pressure. Society is going to come under increasing pressure. We're going to start to see some severe shortages in a lot of different commodities. And this is going to be happening at a time where, at least right now, our governments rarely inspire. The public discourse rarely is something that makes you feel really proud or comforted that we have people who are in positions of power who are actually using that power responsibly. How are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to live with joy and with hope and optimism when basically all of those things are a reality? Can we live with any sense of joy and hope and optimism in that time? Is it rational? Is it reasonable to have any kind of positive atmosphere given what we're already seeing and given what we know to be coming down the road? So a little bit about myself. So I grew up in New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore. And when I was growing up, my dad was the mayor of the town that I grew up in. It was a tiny town, and so it was a part-time job. But I remember every year my mom would do phone banks off the dining room table. My dad would knock on doors, talking to people about what was going on in Chadwick Beach, New Jersey. And I remember my sisters and my brother and I, we were always engaged in social and environmental issues. I wasn't an activist, but we were always having conversations about what was going on in the world. And when I was about 12, 13, 14 years old, one of the big things that were happening, I grew up on a little barrier island on the Jersey Shore. And one of the things that was happening then was the water pollution was horrific. It was awful, as bad as you can imagine it being. It was so bad that there were basically two main sources of the pollution. in the ocean. One was the fact that hospitals in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut were allowed to dump all of their waste, all of it, biological waste and other, right off the coasts. Just dump it straight into the ocean, untreated, without any restraints whatsoever. And so you would be swimming in the ocean, and if the currents were a certain way, and if the tides were a certain right, you'd see hypodermic needles washing up along with the waves. Not the best beach experience. And then the other thing that was happening is that in Toms River, which was a town that is near where I grew up, where I went to high school, there was a large chemical factory that had the only permit in the state of New Jersey to take its raw chemical waste, stuff it into a pipeline that ran through this underneath the center of town, which now has one of the largest cancer clusters in the state of New Jersey. And then the wastes went offshore, the pipeline went offshore by a little bit less than a mile, and it was dumped straight into the ocean. So no filters, no pollution controls, straight from the factory to the ocean. And so people would come out of the water with rashes, people would be getting sick, and it was, again, if the currents were right and if the tides were in a certain way, it was unsafe to swim. And so I saw how these two factors destroyed the local economy. My dad was a home builder, had his own little business, building and remodeling homes. And so nobody wanted to move down to the shore or even fix up their houses if the beaches were closed all summer. So I saw how it impacted not only our own family's economics, but the economics of the entire community, and how the water was completely degraded and the ocean water was unswimmable. And then, when I was about 12, 13, 14 years old, a couple groups started to organize. And literally, it was one or two people within these organizations who just started to say, this is wrong. It's not more complicated than that. This is wrong, and we should do something about it. And so they began to organize. They began knocking on doors, going from neighbor to neighbor to neighbor, saying, look, do you know where this pollution is coming from? It's coming from Toms River Chemical, just located over the bridge. And did you know that hospitals could dump all their trash right into the ocean? This is wrong. We should do something about it. And so they held rallies on the beach. They held town hall meetings. Greenpeace came in and they hung a giant banner off of the water tower in town. They did some civil disobedience. They did everything that they could, trying to figure out a way in which to put pressure on key decision makers and to raise the profile of the issue. Take something that people were resigned to and began to make it intolerable, and to highlight a pathway for how things could change. And it worked. Within a couple years, just a few people were able to inspire hundreds, thousands of people to raise up their voices and to take action. And it all worked. They passed a bill in New Jersey and throughout the tri-state area banning hospital waste dumping offshore. We shouldn't have to fight for things that are that basic, but we did, and we won. And then they also pressured the company, Toms River Chemical, to close the loop in its system to prevent any pollution from reaching the watershed, and eventually change their systems. And eventually the factory shut down about a decade or so later. But now my parents still live there. My wife and our kids, we go to visit there every summer. And when you go in the water, you can, the water's up to here, but I can see my feet. Dolphins swim by, the water's clean, it's safe to swim in. And it shows how activism can work when it's smart, when it works well. And so for me, having had a very formative experience when I was younger, when I was an early teenager, it showed me a lot about how hard it is to affect change, but what the impacts can be when people work together, when they're able to identify a common purpose, when they are persistent and impatient, polite but relentless at forcing change. When all of that happens together, and with a little bit of luck, some amazing things can happen. And so after graduating from school, I began working, sorry, this thing keeps moving because I'm leaning on it. So After graduating from school, I went to work for Greenpeace for a few years, and then I worked at a group called Rainforest Action Network for about 10 years, where our job was to challenge some of America's biggest companies to help protect old-growth forests here in the United States and around the world. Our idea at Rainforest Action Network was that we thought that rather than try to focus on any one law or any one government to affect change, when we knew that it was large, usually American corporations that were driving the destruction of ancient forests, we built campaigns, we built public pressure campaigns to challenge those companies directly. So, for example, we knew that Home Depot was selling wood from almost every ancient forest all the way around the world, and that Home Depot considered itself to be a responsible, appropriate company, modern company with modern environmental values that wanted to do the right thing. And so we focused on the gap between what Home Depot said it was doing and what they actually were doing, and challenged them to stop selling any wood products from any forest anywhere around the world. And it worked. Home Depot, after a couple years of persuasion, large demonstrations, ads in newspapers, celebrities getting involved, shareholder action, agreed that they should be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, and they agreed to phase out any wood coming from the Amazon rainforests, from the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, from the Congo Basin, from the jungles in Borneo, and to shift their supply to more sustainable practices. We did the same thing with Kinko's, the largest user, or Kinko's FedEx, the largest user of paper in the country. And basically, we lined up dozens of companies who were the largest users of wood, the largest users of paper, to change the way in which the logging industry operated, and we helped to save millions of acres in British Columbia, down in Chile, in Indonesia, and all around the world. And so again, this for me pointed out what happens when people work together. Sometimes you have to use confrontation. Sometimes there are decision makers who have so much power and who are not accountable to their shareholders perhaps, or to the government perhaps, or to the marketplace perhaps, that you have to use confrontation to raise the profile of an issue and then force that decision maker to actually change, and use everything that you can to persuade, to inspire them, to challenge them, occasionally to embarrass them, use public pressure in order to inspire them to do the right thing. Based on the assumption that deep down inside, a lot of these executives at a lot of these companies really do want to do the right thing. They just need the right political context in which to do it. And so I came to the Sierra Club about 4.5 years ago, because the Sierra Club's the largest environmental organization in the country. We have volunteer chapters in every state, volunteer group in just about every city across the country, every region. We've got members in every county, every congressional district, and we are volunteer-led. Right? So our core thesis is that climate change or any environmental issue isn't going to be solved by a single person, a single wise, benevolent president or prime minister in some country. It's not going to be solved by a single piece of legislation or a single treaty signed at the UN. Climate change is really going to be solved from the bottom up, through hundreds or probably thousands of policies to shift from SUVs to electric vehicles, to shift from coal to clean energy, to shift from fracking to clean energy, to move out of the tar sands and replace that with energy efficiency and clean vehicles, to divest, to invest. All of these things are going to take place across the country and around the world, mostly from the bottom up. In fact, there's a really good editorial in the New York Times, which either came, I think it was in Sunday's paper, that said the most promising thing that happened in New York City last week wasn't the president's speech, although it was pretty good, and it wasn't the announcements that we heard from the cities of Philadelphia and Houston and Los Angeles, although they were pretty good, and it wasn't the announcements that we heard from IKEA and H&M and a couple dozen companies that they want to go to 100% clean energy, although that was really inspiring. What the New York Times said was the most hopeful thing was what we saw in the People's Climate March. 400,000 people coming together, identifying around a common value, working to fight for a clean energy future, and representing a bottom-up movement that actually has the hope to affect great change. So I've been at the Sierra Club for 4.5 years, and since I've been there, over the last few years, what we have all seen together is some awful news and some good news. The awful news is what I was talking about earlier. You guys read about it or you hear about it just about every day if you look hard enough. You see it happening all around the world if you look hard enough. Give another few days, give it a week at least, and we're going to see another example of some extreme weather event, the likes of which that community hasn't seen in 50, 80, or 100 years. Whether it's a drought that's intensifying, or wildfires that are bigger, spreading faster than anything we've seen before, some kind of severe storm here in the US and around the world. What is now extreme is also becoming the new norm. We know this to be true. We know it to be true. And then get on Comedy Central any night and you can see a really good depiction of our government's response to that and how actually we are not rising to the occasion and beginning to think through reasonably, rationally, how should our government, how should our country be responding to this crisis. So the thing that I feel is most important to understand is that it is true, it is undeniably true that we are in a grim situation. But it is also undeniably true, it is also rarely ever reported, and I think needs to be considered and embraced by all of us for our own sanity and for strategic purposes, that we are making more progress on climate change than anybody thought possible. We're showing more progress in a transition to clean energy than anybody predicted. And a lot of that is due to activism of people like yourselves, people all across the country and around the world. And what we have seen in just particularly the last 18 months is a shift of historical proportions that I think should challenge the notion that we have no hope. And so I'm going to conclude by kind of comparing hope versus optimism versus skepticism, because I don't think there's any right way to settle on the issue. And in fact, I think we have to embrace both at the same time. But first, let me just share what the good news is. So Alex was talking before, when he introduced me, in talking about the work that the Sierra Club and a lot of groups have done to stop new coal-fired power plants. I think it's good to talk about this in a little bit of detail because it shows how, again, when we work together, when we're ambitious, when we're visionary, and when we are persistent and relentless and creative, we can accomplish amazing things. So in 2001, President Bush and Vice President Cheney unveiled their energy plan for the country. As part of that plan, they proposed to build 150 new coal-fired power plants all across the country. The idea had some logic to it. It was flawed logic, but the logic was that in the US we have a very old fleet of coal plants, some of which have been operating since the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. These are old, dirty, decrepit coal plants, but they're belching out huge amounts of power every day. And so Bush and Cheney proposed to build at least 150 new ones and lock in coal as the dominant way in which we produce electricity for the next half century. After that proposal was made, a bunch of utilities got really excited, and so they added proposals for about 50 more additional new coal-fired power plants. So around this time a decade ago, about 10 years or so ago, there were about 200 new coal plants that were being proposed. And again, this would have guaranteed that coal was the dominant way in which electricity was produced all the way through 2050, 2060, and beyond. And so the Sierra Club rose up against this challenge in a big, dramatic fashion by taking on two of those 200 coal plants, right? We had no experience at all. We didn't have experts in the electric sector. We didn't even have lawyers who had ever pulled permits against coal plants. But we had 2 staff people based out of our Chicago office and a bunch of volunteers up in the upper Midwest, and then some more dedicated volunteers down in Kentucky. And we took on 2 of those coal plants. And we began pulling permits. We began, or I should say the staff who were there doing this, it wasn't me, began studying how do coal plants operate? How are they financed? What is the health effects of burning coal? What does mercury do to your brain? What's the effect of soot and smog? What happens when coal ash is dumped near a watershed? They began studying all of this. They began knocking on doors, building a coalition of health professionals, parents, students, teachers, community activists, and they challenged every single air permit that this utility wanted, and they won. And eventually they defeated the coal plant right outside of Chicago, and eventually they defeated the coal plant in Kentucky. So we won on 2, 198 more to go. So these activists then put together a roadshow, and they took on several dozen coal plants in the upper Midwest, all at the same time. And they went from community to community to community and said, hey, did you know this plant's being proposed in your backyard? Do you know what happens when mercury gets into the tuna fish that you might eat? Have you thought about what the health effects are of soot and smog and coal ash? Have you thought about what sulfur dioxide does to your lungs? Have you thought about the fact that there's another way and we can work together? And in community after community after community, we won. We defeated coal plants all across the Midwest, all across Appalachia, from one coast to the other. We defeated coal plants in Florida with the help of Charlie Crist. We defeated coal plants that were proposed in Texas, despite the opposition of Governor Rick Perry. We defeated coal plants that were proposed in the heart of coal country, also on the West Coast, way up on the East Coast, all across the U.S. Of the original 200 coal plants that were being proposed, a nationwide coalition of groups of about more than 2,000 different local groups defeated 185 of all those coal plants that were proposed, from one coast to the other. So, that's good news, right? Shows good progress, but none of it made any progress in lowering greenhouse gas emissions at all, right? All that we did through years and years of work was stop things from getting a whole lot worse and to stop the lock-in of coal-fired power plants for another 50 to 60 years. So about 4 to 5 years ago, as we were successful at defeating almost all of the coal plants that were being proposed, we started focusing on the existing fleet, every single coal plant in the country. Our goal is to move beyond coal and to replace coal completely, 100%, as a way of producing electricity by the end of the next decade. We want to shut down, we want to retire and replace every coal plant and every gas plant within 2 decades and replace all of it with clean energy. And we're making enormous progress. So if you measure from 2009 to today, over the last 5 years, we've been able to shut down about 170 existing coal-fired power plants. These are plants that have either been retired and replaced or are on a schedule to be replaced over the next couple of years. And our goal is every time a plant comes down, we want to be replacing it 100% with clean energy. We're not yet there, but we're making enormous progress. And so all of this work across the country, what it has happened was that it has enabled us to do is begin to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions more than any other country except for the EU. The EU collectively has reduced its emissions more than the U.S. And obviously the U.S. has a long way to go in reducing its emissions. But we've capped. We have already capped our emissions in the United States, and the trajectory is going down. There's going to be blips in that. There's going to be years where it increases a little bit. There's going to be years where it drops precipitously, but it is going down. And the best news out of all of this, and the thing that I think gives me some reason to hope, is that while all of this has been happening, while coal plants have been coming down, the price of clean energy has dropped even more. So much so that the price of solar has dropped by 50%. 50% in the last 4 years. The price of wind has dropped by more than 50% in that same timeline. So we are at the point now where finally, after 40 years of installations of clean energy, after 40 years of homeowners and businesses advocating for clean energy policies, after 40 years where we've been able to get about 30 states to demand clean energy and to set a floor for how much clean energy needs to be installed, we have installed enough solar, we have installed enough wind in the United States, We've achieved enough economies of scale where the price of solar and the price of wind is now cheaper than fossil fuels in large parts of the country. Cheaper than fossil fuels. So think about what that means. If we do polls, I can show you any poll that has been done on climate and energy issues. Any poll across the country, when you interview Democrats or Republicans, when you interview folks who live in rural areas or in our cities, men, women, people who are employed or unemployed, support for clean energy tops the charts. Rarely does it get below 70%. This is for conservative people, progressive folks. This is for evangelical Christians or anarchists, Rockies fans, Yankees fans, doesn't matter. People who breathe, all of them, support, many of them support clean energy. And so since we've hit the point where that clean energy is beginning to become cheaper than their current energy, there's nothing holding us back. And so this is why you're seeing skyrocketing growth in clean energy in the US right now, right? So in Kansas, home of the Koch brothers, right? One of the more conservative states in the country, a state that a few years ago proposed to build new coal-fired power plants, and those plants were defeated and withdrawn. A state that now is beginning to move off of coal. They're scaling up clean energy like they've never seen it before, and they're saving money in the process. In Oklahoma and in Nebraska, also, more conservative states, deep red states. These are states that also proposed coal plants. They weren't built. They're scaling back their existing coal facilities. In Omaha, Nebraska, they will be at 39% of their power coming from wind by 2017. Both states, they're shifting from coal and gas to wind and solar, and they're lowering their rates in the process. Here in Colorado, you had a judge that pushed Xcel Energy to install more solar, and the quote was because solar energy is more reliable and it's cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal, cheaper than nuclear power. In Minnesota, a judge pushed the utility up there to install more solar because it was cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal, cheaper than nuclear power. So we're hitting that tipping point. And when it becomes an opportunity to save money by moving from dirty fuels to clean energy, everything is possible. Everything is possible. So that's what I think it's important to be considering right now, given the time that we're in. All right? And I think actually, as all of you or the students here, as you graduate and as you're entering into the workforce, and as you're thinking about what you want to do with your professional life, I think you should feel it is an awesome time to be alive. It is an awesome time to be a part of this struggle. Because what you'll be a part of, you will be alive at a time when we're seeing our ecosystems degrade. You will be at a time of great chaos and dislocation and a lot of pressure on our water supplies, our food supplies, a lot of pressure on governments that are barely stable right now. But what is also true is that you're going to be alive, you're going to be thriving, you're going to be assuming decision-making authority at a time when we're going to build an economy that's powered 100% by clean energy. Think about that. When we make that change, we're never going back. We're going to build us a society, we're going to build an economy, a society that's powered by clean energy. And once we do that, it's forever. How many folks here think that once clean energy is cheaper than any other polluting form of energy, once we say we don't have to frack in our watersheds, people are going to say, yeah, but that was fun. Let's go back to that. Right? How many folks think that we're going to look back with nostalgia about mountaintop removal and say, yeah, I know solar puts more people to work, and I know solar is cheaper, and it makes our air more clean, and it makes our water more clean, and it gives us a shot at stabilizing emissions. Let's go blow up some more mountains. We have the opportunity, we have the obligation to fight climate change. We have the moral responsibility to do everything that we can to preserve intact ecosystems, to create wildlife corridors, to eliminate toxics from our environment, to fight every plant, every fracking site, every drilling site, every pipeline that we can. We have the responsibility to divest our money from fossil fuels and invest it in clean energy. This is a moral responsibility. It's our moral, ethical obligation as sentient beings on this planet, right? This is what we have to do. This is our duty. But what is also true is that it's not just an obligation. We have an opportunity, an enormous opportunity, to solve multiple problems with a single set of solutions. Because when we move from clean energy, not only are we removing toxins from our air, not only are we taking out the largest sources of water pollution in our country today, not only are we getting a good shot at stabilizing emissions and then bringing emissions down, but we're also targeting the very companies, the very executives who are funneling so much money into our political process and polluting our democracy just at the same time as they're polluting our air and our water and our climate. So I know it can be daunting, and I know it can be depressing to think about what it's like to be alive when our climate is changing and we don't seem to be responding. But I want you to remember that we are making enormous progress. There is reason to be scared. There is reason to be angry. There is reason to be infuriated at what's happening to the planet that you're growing up into. But there's also reason to feel optimistic. There's reason to feel hopeful. And there's reason to feel defiant, because we can create an economy that's powered by clean energy. And together I hope to work with you on that. So thank you.